It was a quiet, unassuming house on the edge of Ravenswood, Illinois, a small town where nothing exciting ever happened. The house, a two-story Victorian with peeling paint and a sagging porch, had been vacant for years. But when 32-year-old Claire Bennett and her husband, Daniel, moved in, they thought they had found their dream home. It was spacious, affordable, and full of character. What they didn't know was that the house had a dark history, one that would soon come back to haunt them. The first sign that something was wrong came just a week after they moved in. Claire was unpacking boxes in the living room when she heard a faint scratching sound coming from the ceiling. She paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped as quickly as it had started. She dismissed it as mice or squirrels and went back to work. But the scratching didn't stop. It grew louder and more persistent, always coming from the same spot, the attic. Claire mentioned it to Daniel, but he brushed it off, saying it was probably just the house settling. "Old houses make noises," he said. "It's part of their charm." Charm or not, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She began to notice other strange things, doors that creaked open on their own, cold spots in certain rooms, and the faint smell of smoke that seemed to come from nowhere. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was all in her head. But then, one night, she saw something that changed everything. It was past midnight, and Claire was lying in bed, unable to sleep. Daniel was snoring softly beside her, oblivious to the world. The scratching had started again, louder than ever, and Claire's nerves were on edge. She got up, grabbed a flashlight, and decided to investigate. The attic door was at the end of the hallway, a narrow, creaky thing that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Claire hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She took a deep breath and turned it, the door groaning as it swung open. A rush of cold air hit her face, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and something else, something metallic. She shone the flashlight up the narrow staircase, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and dust-covered trinkets. The scratching was louder now, coming from the far corner of the room. Claire's heart pounded as she climbed the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silence. As she reached the top, the scratching stopped. The attic was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She swept the flashlight around the room, the beam of light catching on something in the corner. It was an old trunk, its lid slightly ajar. Claire approached it cautiously, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She knelt beside the trunk and pushed the lid open. Inside was a collection of old photographs, letters, and a small, leather-bound journal. The photographs were of a family, a man, a woman, and 2 young children. They looked happy, but there was something unsettling about their smiles, something that sent a chill down Claire's spine. She picked up the journal and flipped through the pages. It was filled with handwritten entries, the ink faded and smudged with age. The first entry was dated October 31st, 1978, and it was written in a shaky, almost frantic hand. "I can't take it anymore. The voices, the scratching, the shadows that move when no one is there. They're real. I know they are, and they're coming for me." Claire's hands trembled as she read the words. She flipped to the next page, her eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. The children see them too. They cry at night, saying there's a man in the attic. I've searched every corner, but there's no one there. No one living, at least. The entries grew more frantic as they went on, detailing strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, disembodied whispers, and the constant scratching that seemed to come from the walls. The final entry was dated November 15th, 1978, and it was written in a single hurried sentence. "They're here. God help us all." Claire dropped the journal, her heart racing. She looked around the attic, the shadows seeming to close in around her. The scratching started again, louder and more insistent than ever. It was coming from the wall behind the trunk. She grabbed the flashlight and shone it on the wall, her breath catching in her throat. The wallpaper was peeling away, revealing something beneath it, something that made her blood run cold. It was a series of symbols carved into the wood in jagged, uneven lines. They looked like some kind of ritual markings, their meaning lost to time. Claire stumbled back, her mind racing. She needed to get out of there. She turned to leave, but as she did, the flashlight flickered and went out, plunging the attic into darkness. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then it stopped. The silence was deafening. And then she heard a voice, low and guttural, coming from the corner of the room. "You shouldn't have come here," Claire screamed, dropping the flashlight and bolting down the stairs. She slammed the attic door shut behind her and leaned against it, her chest heaving. Daniel was awake now, his face pale with concern. "Claire, what's wrong?" he asked, rushing to her side. She couldn't speak. She just pointed to the attic door, her hand trembling. Daniel frowned and opened the door, shining his own flashlight up the stairs. The attic was empty, the trunk closed, and the journal nowhere to be seen. "There's nothing there," he said, turning back to Claire. "You must have had a nightmare." But Claire knew better. She had seen the journal, the photographs, the symbols on the wall, and she had heard the voice. It was real. Whatever was in the attic, it wasn't going to let them go. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences grew worse. The scratching returned, louder and more persistent than ever. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the smell of smoke became so strong that they had to call the fire department, only to be told there was no source of the smell. Claire began to see shadows moving out of the corner of her eye, and she swore she could hear whispers in the dead of night. Daniel tried to reassure her, but even he couldn't deny that something was wrong. They decided to do some research on the house's history, hoping to find answers. What they discovered was more horrifying than they could have imagined. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy businessman named Edward Grayson. He had lived there with his wife and 2 children until 1892, when the entire family vanished without a trace. The house had stood empty for years until it was purchased by another family in the 1920s. They too had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The pattern continued over the decades, with each new family meeting a grim fate. Some vanished, others died under suspicious circumstances, and a few were driven to madness. The house had earned a reputation as cursed, and no one had lived there for more than a few years at a time. Claire and Daniel realized they were living in a house with a dark and bloody history, a house that seemed to have a mind of its own. They tried to leave, but every time they packed their bags, something would stop them. The car wouldn't start, The doors would lock themselves, or they would wake up to find their belongings scattered across the house. One night, Claire had a dream. She was standing in the attic, the symbols on the wall glowing with an eerie light. The voice spoke again, but this time it was clearer, more menacing. "You can't leave. You're part of the house now." Claire woke up screaming, her heart pounding. She knew they had to get out, no matter what. She and Daniel packed their bags and made a run for the door. But as they reached the threshold, the door slammed shut in their faces. The lights flickered and the scratching started again, louder and more frantic than ever. And then they heard it, the sound of footsteps coming down the stairs. Heavy, deliberate footsteps that sent chills down their spines. They turned to see a shadowy figure standing at the bottom of the staircase, its face obscured by darkness. "You're mine now," the figure said, its voice echoing through the house. Claire and Daniel never made it out of the house. Their bodies were found weeks later, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. The house still stands, empty and silent, waiting for its next victims.